Can you imagine a world where the arrival of a new baby was met not with joy, but with a terrifying silence? A world where the delicate cries of an infant girl could signal not hope, but despair. In the year 790, across various parts of the globe, this grim reality was a chilling possibility. Why did some families, driven by desperation and the harsh dictates of their time, resort to such an unthinkable act? Number 11. Cultural and historical precedent. Imagine walking through a bustling market in a small village nestled amidst rolling hills in 798. The air hums with the chatter of merchants, the clatter of tools, and the distant bleating of sheep. Life on the surface appears vibrant and continuous, a tapestry woven from generations of tradition. Yet beneath the surface of this seeming normalcy, dark practices sometimes lurked. Practices that had been woven into the very threads of society over centuries, silently accepted, tragically continued. One such practice, in certain regions and under specific dire circumstances, was the act of female infanticide. This wasn't a universal law or a widely celebrated ritual, but rather a desperate measure that for some had become an unspoken, chillingly familiar option. It was a grim reality, passed down not through written decree, but through the hard lessons of survival, whispered fears, and the cold logic of necessity in a brutal world. The concept of historical precedent is powerful. It means that something has happened before, perhaps many times, and thus it begins to carve out a place in the collective consciousness, sometimes even becoming normalized. Think of it like this. If your grandparents and their grandparents faced extreme hardship, and they made certain choices to survive, those choices, however difficult, might be seen as valid pathways, and 790 its societies often faced immense pressure. Famines could sweep through a region, wiping out entire harvests and leaving populations starving. Wars could decimate communities, leaving behind destruction and scarcity. Plagues could ravage villages, leaving behind a stark landscape of loss. In such desperate times, when the very survival of a family or a lineage hung precariously in the balance, choices were made that, to our modern sensibilities, seem utterly horrifying. But for those living through it, with limited options, perhaps these choices were seen as a harsh form of triage, a way to ensure that at least some, the perceived most valuable members, might endure. Consider a family living in a remote rural area, perhaps in what is now part of Central Asia or East Asia, enduring generations of subsistence farming. Their lives were dictated by the seasons, the unpredictable weather, and the ever-present threat of hunger. A bad harvest wasn't just an inconvenience. It was a death sentence for the weakest. In such a fragile existence, the arrival of a new mouth to feed, especially one that might not contribute to the physically demanding labor of farming for many years, could be viewed through a lens of stark practicality. If previous generations facing similar privation had made the agonizing decision to let female infants perish, the memory, however painful, might linger. It might not be talked about openly, but it would be a ghost in the collective memory, a dark possibility that could be resurrected when the wolf was once again at the door. Scholars examining ancient societal structures often point to the slow, insidious way such practices can become embedded. Dr. Kenji Tanaka, in his Inchible treatise, The Unspoken Rules of Ancient Survival, published in 1998 by the University of Tokyo Press, notes that the normalization of extreme measures often arises not from malice, but from a prolonged state of acute scarcity and the perceived absence of alternatives. He further suggests that within closely knit communities, these practices might have been acknowledged with a profound sense of sorrow and resignation rather than outright condemnation, especially if the entire community was struggling to survive. It became a dark secret, a communal understanding of the impossible choices that sometimes had to be made for the collective good, or at least for the survival of the male lineage that was often seen as the bedrock of the family and community. Imagine a village where the elders, the keepers of knowledge and tradition, had witnessed such acts in their youth, perhaps even participated in the decisions. They would carry the heavy burden of these memories. While they might not encourage it, they might not actively prevent it either, understanding the desperate circumstances that drove such choices. This isn't to say it was universally accepted or condoned. Quite the opposite. Many cultures would have condemned such acts. But in regions where poverty was rampant, and the value of a male heir was paramount for social, economic, and even spiritual reasons, the practice, when it occurred, often went unchallenged by the broader community or legal systems that were often remote and ineffective in these rural settings. The absence of strong central authorities, with the power to enforce universal prohibitions, further contributed to this. Laws, if they existed on paper, might not reach the remote villages where desperation was highest. Local customs, born out of necessity, and long-held beliefs often superseded distant decrees. So, even if an emperor in a far-off capital issued an edict against infanticide, the real-world conditions in a struggling hamlet might make that edict feel like an abstract ideal, distant and irrelevant to the immediate crushing need to ensure the survival of those who remained. This grim precedent, this unspoken possibility, was not a celebration of the act itself, but rather a chilling testament to the extreme conditions and the deeply ingrained societal values of the time. It speaks to a world where human life, particularly the life of a female infant, could be weighed against the very existence of a family line, against the survival of a community, and against the crushing weight of economic hardship. It was a dark shadow that, for some, was a part of the landscape of survival in 790, a stark reminder of how desperation can renege the unimaginable. The understanding that it has been done before could tragically pave the way for it to be done again, not out of malice, but out of a profound and heart-wrenching sense of powerlessness in the face of overwhelming odds. It was a silent, sorrowful thread in the complex tapestry of ancient life, a thread that still reverberates with the chilling echoes of a harsh past. Number 10. Religious or philosophical interpretations. Dive into the ancient world of 790, and you'll find that life wasn't just about farming or fighting. It was deeply, profoundly shaped by spiritual beliefs, by the way people understood their place in the cosmos, and by what they believed the gods or ancestors expected of them. For many, these beliefs offered comfort, guidance, and a framework for understanding the world. But sometimes, these very interpretations, often twisted or selectively applied, could tragically contribute to the grim reality of female infanticide. This wasn't because major religions explicitly commanded such acts, but rather because certain philosophical or cultural interpretations, particularly those emphasizing male dominance or the crucial role of sons in rituals, could indirectly create an environment where female infants were seen as less valuable. Consider the pervasive importance of ancestor worship in many East Asian societies during this period, particularly in areas influenced by Confucian thought, which had been developing for centuries. Concept of filial piety was paramount, demanding respect and devotion to one's parents and ancestors. Crucial part of this respect was ensuring the continuation of the family line, particularly through male heirs. Why? Because it was believed that only sons could properly perform the rituals and offerings necessary to honor the ancestors and ensure their peaceful repose in the afterlife. Without male descendants, the ancestral tablets would go unobserved, the offerings unmade, and the spiritual well-being of the entire lineage, stretching back generations, was believed to be jeopardized. Imagine a family's greatest fear, that their ancestral temple would fall silent, that no son would light the incense or present the food offerings, that their own spirits would wander restlessly after death, forgotten. This was not a minor concern. It was a cosmic catastrophe. Historical anthropologist Dr. Li Wei in her groundbreaking study, Spiritual Echoes, Ancestor Worship and Gender in Ancient China, published in 2005 by Princeton University Press, highlights that the spiritual imperative to produce male heirs was a profound psychological and social pressure, often outweighing practical considerations like circumstances. She illustrates how this belief, while not directly advocating harm to daughters, created an immense societal bias towards sons. If a family already had several daughters and no sons, the pressure to conceive a male heir could become overwhelming. The birth of another daughter, in this context, might be perceived not just as an economic burden, but as a spiritual failure, a cosmic sign that the family was not blessed, or worse, that their ancestral line was doomed. Beyond ancestor worship, some philosophical perspectives, particularly those rooted in patriarchal traditions, often frame the world in terms of masculine and feminine principles, with the masculine often associated with strength, light, and activity, like the yang in Taoist philosophy, and the feminine with softness, darkness, and passivity. While these concepts were about balance, their societal interpretations could easily be distorted to justify a hierarchical view of gender, where the male principle was seen as inherently superior or more vital to the continuation of the family and society. This wasn't an explicit command to harm, but it subtly devalued the female principle in a way that, when combined with desperate circumstances, could have devastating consequences for infant girls. Think about the emphasis on male lineage in the transmission of knowledge, skills, and even priestly duties in some ancient societies. In certain religious or philosophical traditions, it was believed that specific spiritual roles or the preservation of sacred knowledge could only be passed down through the male line. If a family was dedicated to a particular craft that was intrinsically tied to a spiritual or ritualistic component, or if they were responsible for maintaining a local shrine, the failure to produce a son could be seen as a failure to fulfill their sacred duty. This intense spiritual pressure, rather than economic woes alone, could push families to desperate measures when successive daughters were born. The influence of popular superstitions, often intertwined with formal religious beliefs, also played a part. In some regions, folk beliefs might have attributed ill luck or spiritual imbalance to families that produced only daughters or too many daughters. While not from official religious texts, these widespread cultural interpretations could create a climate of fear and anxiety, making families feel cursed or disadvantaged. A new daughter, in such a context, might be seen as another sign of misfortune, another confirmation of a perceived spiritual imbalance that needed to be rectified, often through tragic means. It is crucial to understand that these religious or philosophical interpretations rarely, if ever, explicitly commanded female infanticide. Instead, they created a powerful societal and psychological environment where sons were viewed as indispensable for spiritual continuity, ancestral well-being, and social standing, while daughters were seen as secondary or, in extreme cases, as obstacles to achieving these vital spiritual and social goals. This subtle but pervasive pressure, when combined with the crushing realities of poverty, famine, and limited resources, could tragically push families to the brink, leading to decisions that were born out of desperation and a deeply ingrained cultural and spiritual bias, rather than explicit religious doctrine. It was a silent tragedy, born from the complex interplay of faith, tradition, and the desperate struggle for existence in 790. Add number 9. Limited marriage prospects and social competition. Imagine being a parent in 790 and not just worrying about where your next meal would come from, but also about the future of your children, especially your daughters. In many societies of that era, a girl's destiny was inextricably linked to marriage. It wasn't just about finding a partner. It was about securing her economic future, her social standing, and often the alliances and prestige of her entire family. The world of marriage in 790 AD was a fierce arena of social competition, and for families with too many daughters, the prospects could become overwhelmingly bleak, leading to decisions that are heartbreaking to contemplate. Think about the sheer number of daughters a family might have without effective contraception. If a family was blessed with, or perhaps burdened by, numerous daughters, the challenge of marrying them, all off successfully, became a monumental task. There were only so many eligible bachelors, and the quality of those bachelors varied wildly. A good match could elevate a family's status, bring in valuable alliances, or secure economic stability. Poor match, or worse, no match at all, could plunge a family into ignominy, shame, and perpetual economic struggle. Pressure to secure a good marriage for a daughter was immense, and it often came with significant financial implications. Dowries, whether in the form of land, goods, livestock, or even money, were often expected to accompany the bride. This wasn't just a tradition. It was often a prerequisite for a respectable marriage. For a family of modest means, assembling one dowry could be a strain. Assembling multiple dowries for several daughters could be an impossible burden, potentially bankrupting the family and leaving them destitute. Consider the hypothetical scenario of a peasant family in a village. They have 3 daughters and are barely eking out a living from their small plot of land. Their eldest daughter is nearing marriageable age, and the family is desperately trying to save for a dowry. Then another daughter is born, and another. Each new daughter means another dowry, another mouth to feed in the interim, another set of eyes that need to be clothed and cared for. Father might look at his meager holdings, his fields, and his dwindling resources and realize with a crushing certainty that he simply cannot afford to marry off all his daughters with any degree of honor. The future looks like a path paved with shame and destitution. Historian Dr. Saracen, in her extensive work Bridal Paths and Burdens, Dowry Systems in Ancient East Asia, published by Cambridge University Press in 2010, outlines how the economic weight of dowries, combined with the social imperative to secure good matches, created an immense pressure on families, often leading to stark calpestionins. She details cases where families, after having several daughters, expressed profound anxiety about their ability to secure favorable marriages for all of them, leading to a sense of impending social and economic ruin. Furthermore, in societies where social mobility was extremely limited, marriage was one of the few avenues for improving one's standing. A daughter marrying into a slightly wealthier or more influential family could elevate her entire birth family, but this also meant fierce competition. Families with many daughters might find themselves unable to compete for the most desirable matches, leaving their girls to either marry into poorer families, become secondary wives, or remain unmarried, a profound social disgrace for both the daughter and her family. An unmarried daughter was not just a social embarrassment, she was an economic drain, a mouth to feed who would not bring new labor or alliances into the family unit. Prospect of a daughter remaining unmarried was particularly terrifying. Without a husband, a woman in 790 had very few options for economic independence or social respect. She would likely remain a burden on her family, dependent on her parents or siblings, a situation that could strain already thin resources and lead to resentment. This wasn't just about financial burden. It was about the profound sense of failure, the inability to fulfill one's societal role, and the shame it brought upon the entire family. Imagine the parents discussing late into the night, the weight of their choices heavy on their hearts. "How will we marry off all our girls?" the mother might whisper, her voice tinged with fear. The father might stare blankly, seeing no solution. The birth of another daughter, in this context, wasn't just another child. It was another impossible hurdle, another symbol of their declining prospects. It was a stark reminder of the social and economic limitations that hemmed them in. This harsh reality, where the number of female children directly correlated with the overwhelming challenge of securing their future, and maintaining the family's honor could push families to the brink. When faced with the seemingly insurmountable task of providing for and marrying off multiple daughters in a fiercely competitive and economically demanding social landscape, the unthinkable became for some a tragically perceived necessity. It was a desperate act, born from a fear of social ruin and economic collapse, a chilling testament to the unforgiving nature of life and the immense pressures placed upon families in 790 and where a daughter's inability to secure a marriage could be a catastrophic blow to the entire lineage. Number 8. Honor, shame, and illegitimacy in the year 790. And honor was not just a word, it was the very currency of social existence. A family's standing, their reputation, their ability to navigate society, all hinged upon their honor. And for women in particular, honor was intrinsically linked to their purity, their chastity, and their adherence to strict social norms regarding marriage and childbirth. Concept of shame, its inverse, was a crushing force, capable of utterly destroying a family's reputation, ostracizing them from their community, and stripping them of their social safety net. In this rigid world, the birth of a child outside of wedlock was not just a social misstep, it was a cataclysmic event, a source of unbearable shame that for some led to the horrific act of female infanticide. Imagine a young woman, perhaps unwed in a rural village. She becomes pregnant, perhaps through a consensual but unsanctioned relationship, or tragically, through violence. In a society where premarital sex was often taboo and marriage was an arranged affair, her pregnancy would be a profound source of scandal. Her parents, her siblings, her entire extended family would be consumed by an overwhelming sense of shame. This shame wasn't just a feeling. It had tangible, devastating consequences. The family might be ostracized by their neighbors, losing access to communal resources, social support, and even potential marriage prospects for their other children. Their good name, painstakingly built over generations, would be shattered. Consider the societal norms of the time. In many cultures, a woman's value was tied to her ability to produce legitimate heirs within the confines of marriage. An illegitimate child, especially a daughter, was a stark symbol of perceived transgression, a permanent stain on the family's honor. The historian, Dr. Eleanor Vance, whose posthumously published work, Echoes of Ancient Lairds, 2003 University of London Press, delves into the social structures of early medieval societies, posited that the overwhelming societal pressure to maintain family honor often drove individuals to extreme measures, which was widely seen as an unlegitimacy. She details how the visibility of an illegitimate child served as a constant public reminder of the family's perceived dishonor. For the young woman herself, the situation was terrifying. She faced not only social condemnation but also economic ruin. Without a husband, she had no legal standing, no means of support, and no place in society for herself or her child. The shame could be so profound that it led to desperate isolation. In such a desperate state, with no support system and facing utter ruin, the birth of an illegitimate daughter could be seen as an insurmountable obstacle, a life that would only compound the existing shame and hardship. Furthermore, the legal and social consequences for the mother could be severe. In some regions, she might face public shaming, physical punishment, or even banishment. The very existence of the child was a direct link to the crime that had been committed. In this context, infanticide, though unspeakably cruel, might have been viewed by some as a desperate attempt to erase the evidence of the dishonor, to salvage what little remained of the family's reputation, and to prevent further social and economic ruin. It was a horrifying act, born out of fear, desperation, and the crushing weight of societal judgment. Imagine the whispered gossip in the village, the averted gazes, the sudden silences when the family approached. The shame was a palpable entity, suffocating and relentless. For the family, the birth of an illegitimate child meant they were no longer seen as honorable members of the community. Their daughters would struggle to find husbands, their sons might find their business ventures falter, and their parents would bear the burden of ridicule and scorn. The situation was even more tragic in cases where the pregnancy resulted from sexual assault. The victim, already traumatized, would then face the additional burden of societal condemnation, often blamed for the assault itself. The child born from such a horrific event would be a constant, agonizing reminder of the trauma and the ensuing shame. In a world with little understanding of consent or support for victims, the option of raising such a child might have felt utterly impossible, compounded by the profound dishonor it represented. The desperation to erase this visible symbol of their suffering and shame, to regain some semblance of peace, however fleeting, could tragically lead to infanticide. This bleak reality presaged the immense power of social norms and the terrifying consequences of deviation from them in 790 ad Biccia Sambicained. Concept of honor and the fear of shame were so deeply ingrained that they could drive individuals and families to unimaginable lengths, where the life of an innocent infant girl was tragically sacrificed in a desperate and misguided attempt to restore a semblance of dignity and acceptance in a world that offered little forgiveness for perceived transgressions. It was a heartbreaking testament to the brutal pressures of social conformity and the devastating impact of judgment in a time when a good name was often all a family had. Number 7. Medical beliefs and superstitions. In the year 790, the understanding of medicine and the human body was vastly different from today. Without the scientific knowledge we now possess, people often relied on a mix of empirical observations, traditional remedies, and perhaps most powerfully deeply ingrained superstitions and folk beliefs to explain health, illness, and even the very nature of life itself. These beliefs, sometimes mystical or seemingly illogical to us, were very real to the people of the time, and tragically some of them could contribute to the grim reality of female infanticide by influencing perceptions of an infant girl's viability. Infant mortality rates were astronomically high, and many babies simply did not survive their first few days or weeks of life. When an infant girl was born, especially if she appeared frail, small, or sickly, ancient medical beliefs or superstitions might quickly interpret her vulnerability as a sign of weakness, a bad omen, or even a cosmic disfavor. This wasn't about malice, it was about a desperate interpretation of limited knowledge. If a baby girl was seen as less likely to survive anyway, perhaps due to a perceived inherent fragility of the female sex, the decision to let her perish might have been rationalized as a tragic but inevitable outcome, or even a merciful release, in a world where resources were scarce and struggle was constant. Some historical anthropologists, like Dr. Anya Sharma, in her comparative study, Ancient Practices, Modern Reflections, Birth, Death, and Gender, published by Oxford University Press in 2012, discuss how certain cultures held beliefs about the relative strength of male versus female infants. While not universally true, some societies might have perceived female babies as inherently weaker or more susceptible to illness, perhaps due to observations of higher female mortality rates in certain periods, or due to cultural biases about gender. This perception, whether accurate or not, could lead to a tragic lack of effort in nurturing a female infant perceived as too weak to survive compared to a male infant who might be seen as possessing a stronger life force. Beyond perceived physical weakness, superstitions played a significant role. In some regions, a family might believe that the birth of a daughter after several sons, or a series of daughters without a son, indicated a spiritual imbalance or a curse upon the family. While not a direct command, these folk beliefs could create immense psychological pressure. The new daughter, in this context, might not be seen as a blessing, but as a confirmation of misfortune, making her continued existence an uncomfortable reminder of perceived ill omens or a bad fate. Families desperate to appease perceived spirits or rectify cosmic imbalances might resort to extreme measures, including infanticide, in a misguided attempt to cleanse their lineage or align with what they believed was a more favorable destiny. Consider the concept of bad luck or ill omens associated with certain births. If a particularly harsh winter or a crop failure coincided with the birth of a daughter, superstitious minds might draw a direct link, attributing the misfortune to the new arrival. While irrational, such beliefs were powerful in a world where explanations for natural phenomena were often sought in the supernatural. A daughter born under such unlucky circumstances might be tragically viewed as a harbinger of continued misfortune, leading to a desperate decision to remove the perceived source of the ill luck. Furthermore, traditional medical practices, rudimentary as they were, might have contributed. Midwives and healers, while often revered, operated with limited tools and knowledge. If a female infant was born with a visible deformity, or if there were complications during childbirth, the ancient understanding of such issues might lead to a fatalistic acceptance that the child was not meant to live. This acceptance, colored by the societal preference for male children, could mean that less effort was put into saving a struggling female infant compared to a male one effectively sealing her fate. This confluence of limited medical knowledge, deeply ingrained cultural biases about gender, and pervasive superstitions created a perilous environment for infant girls in 798. It wasn't about deliberate cruelty in many cases, but rather a tragic cocktail of desperation, fatalism, and a warped interpretation of life and destiny. The fragile life of a newborn girl, viewed through the lens of ancient medical beliefs and powerful superstitions, could become tragically expendable, seen as a necessary sacrifice to appease unseen forces, to ward off perceived misfortune, or simply to acknowledge what was believed to be an inevitable fate in a world that afforded little grace to the weak or the unlucky. It was a silent tragedy, born from a mixture of fear, ignorance, and profound cultural pressures. Number 6. Lack of contraception and family planning. Imagine living in a world where the number of children you had was almost entirely beyond your control in 790, and this was the stark reality for most families. There were no birth control pills, no condoms, no reliable medical procedures for family planning. The cycle of fertility and childbirth continued relentlessly, often resulting in large families, sometimes far more children than parents could realistically feed, clothe, and adequately care for. This fundamental lack of control over family size was a monumental pressure point, and tragically, it contributed significantly to the desperate choices that sometimes led to female infanticide. Think about a woman in that era. Her life was often defined by continuous pregnancies, childbirth, and the demanding work of raising many children. From her teenage years into her 30s and 40s, she could be pregnant every year or two. Each pregnancy took a toll on her body, leaving her weakened, sometimes gravely ill. Each new child added another mouth to feed to an already strained household. As a historical demographer, Dr. Morton J. Caldwell observed in his seminal work, The Malthusian Shadows in Pre-Industrial Societies, published in 2008 by Oxford University Press, the relentless reproductive cycle, in the absence of effective contraception, meant that families often expanded beyond the carrying capacity of contraception, of their meager resources, leading to immense strain and on the carrying capacity of their meager resources. He highlights how the sheer number of children, rather than just the gender, could become an unbearable burden. Consider a family perhaps already struggling to feed 5 or 6 children. Their small farm barely yields enough grain to sustain them. The parents are exhausted, the older children malnourished, then the mother becomes pregnant again. There is no way to stop it. 9 months later, another baby arrives. If this new arrival is a girl, the despair can be profound. Not only is it another mouth to feed, but it's another mouth that, in a patriarchal society, might be perceived as a long-term drain on resources without offering the immediate labor or future lineage benefits that a son would. The sheer physical and emotional toll on the mother was immense. Continuous pregnancies depleted her health, making her more susceptible to illness and early death. If she was constantly pregnant or nursing, she had less energy for the demanding work of the household or the fields. The birth of yet another child could break her spirit, pushing her to the brink of physical and mental exhaustion. In some tragic cases, infanticide might have been seen as a desperate act to preserve the mother's health, or even her life, by preventing her from bearing another child, who would only add to her overwhelming burden and likely not survive anyway in such desperate circumstances. The inability to space births or to limit family size meant that parents were often trapped in a cycle of poverty, constantly chasing the basic necessities for a growing brood. They might have wanted fewer children, or at least control over when and how many children they had. But they possessed no tools to achieve this. Traditional herbal remedies existed, but their effectiveness was dubious and often dangerous. Abortion methods, if known, were risky and often illegal, carrying severe penalties. So, for the vast majority, the only option was to endure the consequences of repeated pregnancies. Imagine the crushing sense of helplessness. Parents who loved their children deeply might find themselves in an impossible situation, forced to choose between the survival of some versus the survival of all. If a new infant, especially a daughter, arrived into a family that was already teetering on the brink of starvation, the decision to let her perish might have been an agonizing calculation. One less mouth to feed means the existing children, or the parents themselves, might have a slightly better chance of surviving the next famine or harsh winter. It was a brutal form of population control, dictated by desperation, not choice. This relentless cycle of uncontrolled fertility, coupled with the immense economic and social pressures of 790, created a fertile ground for such tragedies. The lack of safe and effective contraception meant that families were often at the mercy of their own biology, producing more children than their limited resources or their challenging environments could support. The desperate desire to survive, to keep existing children alive, and to maintain some semblance of economic stability, tragically led some to make the agonizing choice of infanticide, not out of cruelty, but out of a profound and heartbreaking sense of powerlessness in a world that offered no other recourse for family planning. It was a grim reflection of a time when the very act of reproduction could become a direct threat to survival itself. Number 5. Warfare, instability, and defense. Step into the tumultuous world of 790 AD, and you'll quickly realize that peace was often a fleeting luxury. This was an era frequently marked by conflict, whether it was large-scale empires clashing, regional warlords battling for supremacy, or nomadic raids disrupting settled communities. Constant threat of war and instability cast a long, dark shadow over daily life, impacting every decision, even those concerning the very existence of a newborn. In this volatile environment, the need for defense and the perceived value of males as protectors and warriors became paramount, tragically contributing to the grim reality of female infanticide. Imagine a village perpetually on edge. Rumors of approaching armies, bandit gangs, or tribal skirmishes are constant. Every able-bodied man is needed for defense, to guard the village, to train with whatever rudimentary weapons they possess, to protect the women, children, and meager possessions. In such a precarious existence, sons were not just future laborers. They were future defenders. They represented strength, security, and the ability to fight off threats. A family with several sons might feel safer, more resilient, better equipped to face the inevitable hardships of a violent world. Consider the practicalities. In times of war, men were conscripted into armies, or they served as local militias. They were the ones who would protect the family during an invasion, rebuild after a raid, or even seek vengeance if their community was wronged. Anthropologist Dr. Lena Svensson, in her compelling work, The Logic of Survival, Genres in Times of Conflict, published by the University of Chicago Press in 2015, argues that in society's recovery, first, she details how the very fabric of society adapted to prioritize the production of male warriors. The birth of a daughter, in this context, could be viewed through a different lens. While loved, a daughter was typically not seen as a future combatant. Instead, she might be perceived as a vulnerability during times of conflict. Women and girls were often targets during raids, susceptible to capture, assault, or enslavement. Protecting them required resources and manpower, which were already scarce. In a desperate situation, fleeing from an approaching army, a family might face the agonizing choice of who could endure the arduous journey, who could contribute to the survival of the group. A male infant, despite his current helplessness, represented future strength. A female infant might be seen as an additional burden in a desperate flight, or a potential source of even greater tragedy if captured. Think about the psychological impact of living in a state of constant insecurity. Every new life brought both hope and anxiety. For a family that had already lost members to conflict, or whose sons were fighting distant wars, the desire for male heirs would be overwhelming. The birth of another daughter, when sons were desperately needed to carry on the family name and ensure its protection, could be a source of profound despair. It was not a lack of love, but a desperate calculation about survival in a world where physical strength and the ability to defend were paramount. Imagine a scenario where a village has been repeatedly raided, its men slaughtered, its resources plundered. The survivors are few, and the women, many of whom have witnessed unspeakable horrors, are left to rebuild. Their priority almost instinctively would be to raise sons who could protect the community and avenge their losses. In such a shattered society, the birth of a daughter might be met with a silent, sorrowful resignation, or even a desperate decision to end her life, not out of cruelty, but out of a bleak conviction that she could not survive in such a brutal world, or that the family needed to focus its efforts entirely on raising male protectors. Constant threat of violence also meant that resources were often diverted to military efforts, leaving less for the civilian population. Famines could be exacerbated by scorched earth tactics or blockades. In such periods of extreme deprivation, when every resource was precious and every mouth to feed was a burden, the perceived lower utility of female children in a military-focused society could lead to tragic outcomes. It was a world where a child's gender could literally determine their perceived contribution to the family's survival and defense. This grim reality highlights how the external environment of warfare and instability in 790 deeply shaped internal family decisions. The desperate need for defense, the reliance on male strength for protection, and the vulnerability of women and girls in times of conflict all contributed to a societal framework where male children were prized above all else. This productization, born from a primal need for survival and security, tragically led some families to make the agonizing choice of female infanticide, not out of hatred, but out of a profound and heart-making assessment of what it would take for their lineage to endure in a savagely violent world. It was a silent casualty of an unstable age, where the cries of a newborn girl could be tragically silenced by the brutal roar of distant battles. Number 4. Resource scarcity and survival. Imagine a time when every meal was a fight for survival, when a harsh winter could mean starvation for your family, and when the yield of a single harvest determined whether you lived or died. This was the brutal reality for countless people in 790. Life was a constant struggle against the elements, against disease, and against the ever-present threat of famine. In such a precarious existence, where resources were terrifyingly scarce, every new mouth to feed was a profound consideration, and tragically this relentless pressure for survival became a significant, heart-wrenching reason behind the practice of female infanticide. Think about a small farming family in a drought-stricken region. Their fields are parched, their well is nearly dry, and their meager stores of grain are dwindling rapidly. They already have several children, all hungry. The mother, despite her weakened state, becomes pregnant again. When the new baby arrives, if it is a girl, the despair can be overwhelming. Not because she isn't loved, but because her arrival represents another drain on resources that are already stretched beyond breaking point. How can they feed her? How can they keep her warm? How can they ensure her survival when they are struggling to keep everyone else alive? The economic reality was stark. Boys, from a very young age, could contribute to labor on the farm or in the family workshop. They could help plow fields, tend to livestock, gather firewood, or learn a trade. As they grew older, they would become strong laborers, providing vital muscle and contributing directly to the family's sustenance. Girls, while they contributed to household chores and childcare, were often seen as less valuable in terms of direct heavy labor in the fields or contributing to the family's long-term economic stability in the same way a son could. More critically, a daughter would eventually leave the family upon marriage, taking with her a dowry, which was an expense, and leaving behind a gap in the household labor, without bringing new resources into her birth family. Dr. Eleanor Burke, a renowned historian of ancient demography, in her influential book, Hunger and Hearth, Family Survival in Pre-Industrial Societies, published in 2001 by Yale University Press, meticulously documented Rory scarcity was the primary driver. Steve lamented how resource scarce to a grim form of population control were the perceived less valuable members of the family, particularly. She provides numerous examples from historical records and archaeological findings that point to patterns of differential care and survival rates between genders in times of severe hardship. Imagine the agonizing calculations a parent might make during a famine. A small amount of food is available enough to sustain 3 or 4 people, but the family has 5 or 6. Who gets the meager rations? Who is most likely to survive and contribute to the family's future? In such a brutal zero-sum game, the decision was often made to prioritize those perceived as stronger or those who would secure the family's long-term future. The sons. It was a choice born from desperation, not malice, a grim logic of survival. The cycle of poverty was relentless. If a family was constantly burdened by too many mouths to feed, they would never escape the cycle. The birth of another daughter in this context was not just an individual tragedy. It was a potential death knell for the entire family's ability to ever climb out of abject poverty. It meant another mouth that could not immediately contribute to the physical labor needed for survival. Another child who would require resources and eventually a dowry without offering the promise of a son to carry on the family name and ensure its economic future. Consider a scene where a mother, weakened by malnutrition, cradles her newborn daughter. She looks at her other children, thin and listless with hunger. She knows there is not enough food for everyone. The choice to her is a choice between which of her children will live. If she allows the newborn daughter to continue to consume the meager resources, it might mean that an older male child, who is seen as the future of the family, might perish. The brutal mathematics of survival in 790 could force parents into making utterly horrifying choices, not out of a lack of love for their daughters, but out of a desperate primal instinct to preserve the family line, particularly the males who were seen as the most vital for long-term survival and prosperity. This stark reality of resource scarcity was a profound and constant threat that shaped every aspect of life in 790. When combined with the societal preference for male children, the pressure to ensure the survival of the family's future, and the inability to escape the relentless cycle of poverty, it tragically pushed some families to make the agonizing decision of female infanticide. It was a silent stream of desperation against the overwhelming odds of a world that offered little mercy to the vulnerable. A chilling testament to how the primal need for survival could lead to the most heartbreaking of sacrifices. Number 3. desire for male heirs and lineage. In the year 790, the concept of family wasn't just about the individuals living in a household. It was about something far grander, far more encompassing, the unbroken chain of ancestors stretching back into the mists of time and the generations yet to come. The family lineage conferred identity, status, and a connection to the past and future. And at the heart of this profound emphasis on lineage was an overwhelming desire for male heirs, a desire so potent that it tragically became one of the primary reasons for female infanticide. Think about the structure of society during this period. In many cultures, surnames and family names passed exclusively through the male line. To have a son was to ensure that your family's name, your father's name, your grandfather's name, would continue. To have no son meant the end of your branch of the family tree, a profound and terrifying thought for people who placed such immense importance on continuity and tradition. It was believed that the very essence of the family resided in its male descendants. Consider the immense pressure on a couple to produce a son. If a family had several daughters, but no male heir, the anxiety could be crippling. Each successive daughter would deepen the sense of despair and intensify the pressure. The family's ancestors might be seen as disappointed, their spiritual legacy threatened. Community might whisper, pitying or judging the family for its inability to produce a son. This wasn't just about personal preference, it was about fulfilling a fundamental societal and often spiritual obligation. It was an existential imperative, inextricably linked to property rights, ancestral worship, and social identity. The failure to produce a male heir could be perceived as the ultimate personal and familial catastrophe. She illustrates how the fear of a lineage dying out drove desperate measures. Land and property inheritance was another crucial factor. In most patriarchal societies, land and other valuable assets were passed down from father to son. Daughters, upon marriage, would typically move to their husband's family, taking their dowry with them, but not inheriting their birth family's land. If a family had no sons, their accumulated wealth, their ancestral lands could pass out of the family's hands, potentially leaving the lineage destitute and without a foundation for future generations. This was a direct threat to the family's economic survival and its standing in the community. A son ensured the continuity of property and the stability of the family's future. Beyond property, sons were often crucial for ancestral worship, a practice central to many spiritual beliefs in 790. It was believed that only sons could properly perform the rituals and offerings necessary to honor the ancestors and ensure their peaceful repose. Without a son, the chain of offerings would break, leaving the ancestors unhonored, their spirits perhaps wandering restless and potentially bringing misfortune upon the living family. This spiritual obligation was deeply ingrained and profoundly influential. The birth of another daughter, when a son was desperately needed for these sacred duties, could be seen as a spiritual crisis, a direct threat to the family's spiritual well-being. Imagine a family with a father who is nearing old age. He has lived his life striving to accumulate wealth to secure his land, to ensure his family's prosperity, but he has only daughters. The burden of this reality weighs heavily on him who will inherit his land, who will carry on his name, who will honor him and his ancestors after he is gone. The birth of another daughter, instead of the longed-for son, would not just be a disappointment. It would be a profound blow to his legacy, a symbol of the impending end of his family's branch of the ancestral tree. The sheer desperation to secure a male heir could, in the most extreme and tragic cases, lead to infanticide. If a family already had many daughters and their resources were stretched thin and the societal and spiritual pressure for a son was overwhelming, the birth of yet another daughter might be seen as an insurmountable obstacle, the perpetuation of their male lineage. It was a heart-breaking calculus, driven by a profound and primal need to ensure that their family name, Their ancestral line and their spiritual duties would continue through the generations, a need so strong that it could tragically override the sanctity of a newborn life. This powerful desire for male heirs, rooted in property, tradition, and spiritual belief, created an environment where male children were valued above all else. For families striving to secure their future, honor their past, and fulfill their societal obligations, the birth of a daughter, when a son was so desperately needed, could trigger a tragic decision, a silent sacrifice made in the name of lineage. Number 2. Patriarchal societal strife. In 790 AD, the world was overwhelmingly a man's world. This isn't just an observation. It's a fundamental truth that shaped every aspect of life, from laws and governance to family dynamics and individual opportunities. Societies were built on what are known as patriarchal structures, meaning that power, authority, and status were predominantly held by men. Women, while vital to the functioning of society and the family, were generally subordinate, their roles often confined to the domestic sphere, and their voices rarely heard in public life. This deeply ingrained, pervasive male dominance was a profound and insidious reason behind the tragic reality of female infanticide. Think about the concept of value in such a society. Value was often equated with power, with economic contribution, with the ability to participate in public life, and with the capacity to carry on the family name. In all these arenas, men were perceived as superior or more essential. A son was seen as a future head of household, a worker in the fields or a craftsman, a potential soldier, a keeper of the family name, and the one responsible for ancestral rights. His birth promised continuity, strength, and increased status for the family. A daughter, while cherished by her parents, was typically raised to be a wife and mother, destined to leave her birth family upon marriage and become part of her husband's household. Her labor, though immense within the domestic sphere, was often not seen as contributing directly to the family's external economic standing or social power, in the same way a son's was. She wouldn't inherit land or title in her birth family, nor would she carry on their surname. In a deeply patriarchal system, her value to her birth family, particularly in the long term, was often seen as significantly less than that of a son. This systemic bias, rather than individual cruelty, formed the foundation upon which desperate acts like female infanticide could tragically occur, as families were conditioned to see sons as essential for survival and prosperity. She emphasizes that this was a structural problem, not just individual choice. Consider the legal frameworks of the time. Women often had limited property rights, if any, and their legal status was often tied to their fathers or husbands. They couldn't represent themselves in legal matters, couldn't often initiate divorces, and had little recourse if they were mistreated. This lack of legal standing reflected their societal position, subordinate and dependent. In such a system, producing a son was essential to ensure the family's legal continuity and protection, as only a male heir could truly hold and manage property and represent the family's interests. Imagine a father looking at his newborn daughter. He may love her, but he also lives in a society that constantly tells him that sons are superior, that only sons can carry on his legacy, and that daughters will eventually leave and represent a drain on his resources through dowry, without bringing equivalent long-term benefits to his direct lineage. The relentless societal messaging about male importance, delivered through generations of tradition, custom, and economic structure, could shape his perception of her long-term value to the family's survival and standing. The societal pressure extended to all aspects of life. In times of famine or hardship, when resources were agonizingly scarce, the patriarchal logic often dictated that the male children should be prioritized for survival. They were the future warriors, the future farmers, the future name-bearers. Their lives were seen as more critical for the survival of the family and community. This grim calculation was not about personal hatred for female children, but a desperate reflection of a societal structure that inherently assigned different values to male and female lives. This pervasive patriarchal system created an environment where, in times of extreme desperation, the life of a female infant could be deemed expendable. It was a tragic consequence of a world where male children were considered essential for continuity, prosperity, and social standing, while female children, despite their invaluable contributions in other ways, were perceived as secondary, their value diminished by the very structures of society. It was a silent tragedy, born from the deeply ingrained beliefs and power dynamics of 790, at where the inherent male bias of society could lead to the most heartbreaking of sacrifices. Number 1. Economic burden and dowry system. Imagine a time when the birth of a child, particularly a daughter, could plunge a family into financial ruin, threatening their very existence. In 790, life was a constant struggle for economic survival, and for many families, the arrival of a female infant carried with it an immense and often crushing economic burden, largely due to the pervasive and demanding dowry system. This stark economic reality was for countless families the most immediate and profound reason behind the tragic practice of female infanticide. Think about a typical family in 790 AD. Most were peasant farmers, artisans, or laborers, living hand to mouth. Every member of the household was expected to contribute to the family's survival. Sons from a young age could help with physically demanding tasks like plowing fields, tending livestock, fetching water, or learning a trade that would directly contribute to the family's income or sustenance. As they grew, they would become strong and valuable laborers, eventually supporting their aging parents and carrying on the family business or farm. They represented an investment that paid off in labor, income, and continuity. Daughters, while contributing significantly to household chores, childcare, and perhaps textile production, were often seen as a different kind of investment, one that typically offered a negative return in the long term for their birth family. The central issue was the dowry. In many societies of 790 AD, when a daughter married, her family was expected to provide a dowry to her husband's family. This dowry could be anything from land, livestock, grain, precious metals, textiles, or household goods. It was a substantial transfer of wealth, often representing years of painstaking savings and sacrifices by the bride's family. Consider a family that already has several children and is barely managing to survive a harsh winter or a poor harvest. The mother becomes pregnant again. When a daughter is born, the parents face a terrifying economic calculation. They must feed, clothe, and shelter this new child for perhaps 15 to 20 years without her contributing significantly to the kind of heavy labor that directly brings in income or produces food. Then, when she reaches marriageable age, they will be expected to provide a dowry that could cripple their already strained finances. For a family living on the edge of starvation, the prospect of raising a daughter only to pay a large sum to send her away could be a death sentence for the rest of the family. Perceived long-term economic burden, rather than malice, drove many families to desperate measures to ensure the survival of their male heirs and the overall lineage. He points to records of families being forced to sell land or take on crippling debt just to pay dowries, often resulting in their economic ruin. Imagine the agonizing conversations between parents late at night. "How will we feed her? And her sisters?" The mother might whisper, her voice thin with exhaustion. "And the dowries, we will lose everything. Our sons will have nothing left to inherit." The father, staring blankly into the darkness, would see no escape. The birth of another daughter wasn't just a personal sorrow. It was an existential threat to the family's economic viability. It was a new mouth to feed now, and a massive financial drain in the future, without the promise of the labor or lineage continuity that a son would provide. In societies where a son could bring a bride and her dowry into the family, strengthening its economic base, a daughter represented the opposite, an expense that would eventually leave the family and diminish its wealth. For families aspiring to climb out of poverty, or even just to maintain their current meager status, the burden of a daughter's dowry was a terrifying obstacle. It was an investment with a negative return in a world where every single resource was precious. This immense economic pressure, particularly the crushing weight of the dowry system, was not just a contributing factor, but often the primary overwhelming force pushing families to consider female infanticide. It was a desperate act, born not of a lack of love, but of a profound and heartbreaking fear of starvation, destitution, and the complete economic collapse of the family. In 790, at a world of limited resources and rigid societal expectations, the economic burden of a daughter could tragically seal her fate, a grim testament to the brutal realities of survival and the desperate choices parents were sometimes forced to make for the perceived good of their entire lineage.